Welcome to the Fatherhood Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Pluff. Each week, we will cover various topics that dads struggle with in their fitness journey. I'll give you actionable steps that you can apply right away, not only to take back control of your own health, but so you're able to be a better example for your kids too. All right, welcome into this week's episode of the Fatherhood Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Pluff, and today we have a very cool guest on here. We have Tim Campbell with us. Tim is releasing a book coming up here in just over a month here called Holding Up the Sky, Intergenerational Lessons of Fatherhood. And so I'm going to let him introduce himself. He's going to share a little bit about the book, and then we'll get started.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. A pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I'm older than you. I turn 82 next month, and I've had this long experience the last 40 years of raising 3 kids, 2 who are gifted and 2 who have disabilities. So one is both gifted and disabled. The book's called Holding Up the Sky, Intergenerational Lessons of Fatherhood. It's a story about my struggles over the years to deal with the kids, not just their mismatches and play dates and medicines and therapy sessions and stuff like that, but also kind of the inter-family dynamics of kids who are both gifted and disabled. So, it was a tough row to hoe for a long time. I always started, I think back on my experience, I think when guys become dads, they have to solve a puzzle about fatherhood. What kind of father are they going to be, right? Mm-hmm. So in my case, I had a kind of a passive-aggressive dad, a dad who had no tools to be a dad. I mean, He watched his house burn down when he was a toddler. His mother raised 8 kids as a single mom. Then the Depression hit. Dad was very cautious and skeptical, and show me kind of and follow these rules and don't ask any questions. So I vowed not to be that kind of dad. I vowed I'm going to be a softer dad. I was going to be more open. They're going to be more connected to my kids. And with our first daughter, Alana, it worked fabulously well. I mean, it was one I was in dreamland, daddyhood. Okay. Yeah. 3.5 years later, Alana's sister, Catherine, was born. Okay. In the first week of life, she was stricken by a viral infection of the heart and wasn't expected to live. The doc said, I gave her a 1 in 10 chance when she was admitted to pediatric intensive care. And she had, with the virus was winning the battle, she had brain anoxia, she has comprehension issues, memory problems, hearing loss, epilepsy, heart issues. It was very difficult. And the night she survived her 3rd heart failure while still in pediatric intensive care, my father died. And it was just like, I'm looking up at this guy and he says, "Are you playing a joke on me? What is this?" And the next day, of course, I had to tell the oldest daughter, Alana, that her grandfather had passed and that her baby sister is still in the hospital fighting for her life. And at that moment, I felt like I had to put my arms up and hold up the sky. I just felt like there was this overwhelming power, could destroy my family, and I was the only guy who could protect them. Okay. So I had to be the sky holder, and that's why you get the title, Holding Up the Sky. An anecdote is that 3 years later, our son Eric was born, and he turned out to be as bright as his oldest sister, but also had a very serious hearing loss. So after about a year in, Catherine is now 4 and Alana is 7. That year, I was holding Eric, walked into the living room, which was filled with empty boxes from a recent move. And I was just overwrought with the kinds of issues I was dealing with then. We just learned that Eric had a hearing loss. He was going to be soon be fitted with hearing aids, that his older sister was still all kinds of therapies and medications. And Alana, I don't know what was happening to Alana then. She's a very bright kid. And um, of course, I tried to be as close to Alana as possible. We're still very close, in our senior years. But at that time, I was carrying Eric through the living room, and I stumbled on an empty box, and I had a meltdown. I started kicking the boxes all over the place, left and right. I was twisting my body and yelling and screaming and, like, what the F is this? How am I going to get through this? And I almost launched Eric into the sky. It was like, it was an inadvertent, totally desperate move. And I had to take the knee. I said, oh my God, what's happening to me? Down on my knee, count to 20, take a deep breath. And that was the moment I realized, I was driving a stake right through the heart of my vow to be a different kind of dad. And I really had to redouble the effort. So that was sort of the beginning. In fact, it's the beginning of the book. It's the early part of the book. And I began writing 2 decades ago, just taking notes and, trying to make sense of what was happening and, try to ingest it a little bit. And, but in the end, it took 10 years to write the book. I drew a lot of lessons out of it, like you can be too soft. Sometimes my dad would have been a better dad than me with my disabled kids. Draw the line, don't give in. But with disabilities, it's very hard to do that because you see it's not their fault. They're trying hard, but they sometimes can't do it. But I think the one thing that really did work was just being closer to the kids built a foundation of trust. They trusted me, and so that I think that helped a lot to get through things. And the kids, grew up and became. Then one has a PhD, one has a couple of master's degrees. Catherine swims. The sick one, today swims 2 miles a day, 5 days a week. So it's like,
That's awesome.
So that's it. It's but I did leave behind for the kids a different kind of puzzle. They have to solve their own puzzle, when they become parents, because I was a different father and maybe they didn't like the way I did things. So that's sort of the book in a nutshell. It's on, if you go to the website, holdingupthesky.net, a net to hold up the sky, holding it one word. You can find it. So that's kind of the pitch, Anthony.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good introduction. And like I told you before we started recording here, I'll make sure to have all the links and everything in the show notes, so that anyone listening can pre-order and grab the book. But there's something you said there. I think it's really common for we see a lot of, like, unfortunately, I say it's common that when I speak to a lot of people, it's always a list of what I'm going to do different than what my dad did, or what I'm going to do different than what my parents did, how I was raised. I'm not going to do it this way. Right. How old were you when you first became a dad?
Well, I married late. Linda and I were the same age we were married. We were 75. So I was 32.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, both of us had been around the block. We dated a lot, and had relationships and stuff. But both of us were thinking about having kids, and so I had a lot of time to think about it. Yeah. And she helped me work through, your dad did a number on you, kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, was there ever a point, because I know, like, so my oldest is 6, so obviously my experience is quite a bit different than everything you've gone through already, but I remember there was a point, like the first few years, you're just so excited, everything's new, you're excited to be a dad, and some of those things don't cross your mind really. It's like, I'm going to do this different, I'm going to do that different, until they get a little bit older, and then you start to realize it's like and then I feel like you kind of go through this phase where you're like, okay, I'm going to do this different, and then there's a point where you're like, okay, well, now I understand what they were going through and stuff. Right. And it's like, you all of a sudden, it's like the longer you're a dad, the more kids you have, you start to be more empathetic to your own parents, realizing like so I have two sisters. My younger sister, she's only 14 months younger than me. And so like I'm thinking like, and I didn't think much of it growing up. And then now that we have three kids, we have one on the way, and they're all about 2 years apart. And I was like, 14 months apart. That means like my mom
Yeah.
was pregnant when I
That's
was
fast.
5 months old.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And so was there ever a point where you started to maybe, obviously still trying to learn from like your dad, but was there ever a point where things started to shift where you're like, I'm really glad he taught me this, or I'm really glad he was this way? And
I think that I mentioned just a few minutes ago that I thought that, dad's laying down the law. He was a Marine. Okay.
okay.
He was, and, he had 8 brothers and sisters, raised by a single
Yeah.
mom, so they went through a
Yeah.
lot of tough stuff. And I still relish the memory of his stories, like taking a freight train over the Sierras in the middle of the winter, to get to college, which is like
Yeah.
an incredible story of, perseverance, and you can't give
Mm-hmm.
up. And, those kinds of things still resonate. But they were kind of deep in the background of my own father,
Right.
sort of shaped me as a person, but didn't come out directly as a lesson to the kids. I mean,
Right.
when Alana was little, she was 3 years old, and I was teaching her about language and love and life and stuff, and she was teaching me
Mm-hmm.
whether it was working or not. We just had a fabulous time. I'd change her
Yeah.
diapers and drive the carpool and stuff like that. Unfortunately, at the time I was a consultant, so I could work from home. This was way back in in
Mm-hmm.
the early '80s, and so, but I didn't really have front of mind lessons that my dad brought forward, and applied it to my
Yeah.
kids. But
Yeah.
I could see, just as you were pointing out, later on, as the kids grew older, I'm looking back and I said, yeah, dad would have been better here. In fact, I closed the book with a chapter with a conversation with my dad. Okay, an imaginary conversation. And I said,
Yeah.
okay, Dad, you were right about this. And
Yeah.
I wish I could have implemented it, but
Yeah.
um, yeah,
Yeah. I think I think it is difficult because like as you were growing up, like, I mean, as kids, like our kids, I don't, not that they don't care, they just don't know that they're supposed to care, that what we went through, like
yeah,
everything. And so it's
yeah,
like, but and then we forget though that, like our parents were kids too, and so
right.
they went through their own set of challenges and stuff. And so I like to think like, you know, my dad did better than his dad, and I'm going to do better. It's just like we're just passing it down the line. We're always
Exactly.
improving. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, right? There's not, a lot of times there's bitterness and there's anger involved, and there's,
Right.
we go too
And there's,
far the other way.
yeah. Well, and there's these changing circumstances also. We live in a social media age now, right? And I mean, our
Yeah.
dads didn't have anything like that in their
No.
lives. And, when I talked about sort of revising the template of fatherhood,
Mm-hmm.
you're always looking backwards at the lessons that you learned from your dad, but you're moving quickly forward into the future. And some of these things just don't connect. Um,
Yeah.
like, the kids, particularly Eric, who had the hearing loss, and was kind of a bright kid. Um, One of his strategies was to dive into video games. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so this is not uncommon these days. Okay,
Yeah.
and but it got to be a problem. He would overdo it a little bit. He would go too long on the video games, and then we had these fights and struggles over that. Um, but at the same time, it was a kind of a survival strategy for him, because
Yeah.
sometimes he couldn't cope. Not only did he have a hearing loss, that deeper than that, he had what they call audio processing problem. It took him sort of extra milliseconds to make sense of what he's been hearing.
Yeah.
Okay, so he was a little bit slow in some ways, um, and so that is a kind of an example of having to make these adjustments and figure out, as we're moving into this future,
Mm-hmm.
how we handle these situations.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's,
Yeah. So those are, I mean, those are pretty big extremes there. Having a dad who was in the military, and then you having your own kids with kids with disabilities. Like that's obviously those two worlds
Yeah.
um, make it very challenging. And when you were younger, like before you had kids, before you were married, would you consider yourself somebody who was, you know, like empathetic, somebody who would be vulnerable with your wife, or did that have to develop?
No, I think I came out like that. That was,
Okay.
yeah, I sort of, from the minute I opened my eyes, I think I had this, I empathize, I can feel vulnerable. The night I told my daughter Alana about her grandfather passing, she could see the tears in my eyes and hear the quiver in my
Mm.
voice. She knew
Yeah.
even at 3.5, that, but she also saw, I think, that I soldiered on, after that, still taking care of her
Mhm.
baby sister and still trying to take care of her. So, there's this issue of strength and vulnerability, that comes up with fathers. And it's
Mhm.
particularly connected sometimes to the idea of masculinity and who we are as men, and that we have to be strong. And it's true.
Yeah.
We have to show strength for the kids. But
Yeah.
I think also my kids benefited from knowing that I was feeling the world also.
Mhm.
I could feel that sadness and feel the grief and at certain times show it to the kids. And I think that
Yeah.
that was one of the doors that opened to allowed us to have a more trusting relationship. So
Mhm.
we're all built differently. We all come at these
Yeah.
things in a different way, and so I just had to sort of play the cards as I was as I was dealt them
Yeah.
the best I could.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, there's probably three or four things there that I wanted to touch on that I thought were pretty interesting. But a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned that in your book, at the end of the chapter, you had an imaginary conversation with your dad.
yeah,
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
yeah. I had finished the book, and I put it down for almost 4 years because I just
Hmm.
didn't know what to do. What was it good enough? Is it right for the family? Is it right for me? Do I want to put it out there? And and it had a completely different ending at
Hmm.
that time. And then as I thought about it, I thought, well, to sew this up well, I had to go back and see if I can close the loop with my dad because it is about
Yeah.
intergenerational lessons. And so I made this fictional conversation with my father, a kind of a summary of the lessons.
Yeah.
So, and at one moment, I picture us sitting on the porch, in rocking chairs, and and I think I start out the conversation saying something like, Dad, after all, I think you would have been better at raising my kids than I was in the way that you could lay down the law and not take any exceptions, and and be strong,
Mhm.
and then he would say back to me, he says, yeah, but maybe, but you did have your trust with your kids. You had that. And then he says, I'm sorry we couldn't have developed the same level of trust between us,
Mhm.
which was also an issue because one of the reasons I had made this pledge to be different from my dad is that, he, like, for instance, here's a couple of anecdotes. He put me on a horse when I was 6. You're going to learn to ride. We had a horse and we had 2 acres out in the far past the suburbs in Sacramento.
Mhm.
And you're going to learn to ride. And I said, well, what about a saddle? He says, well, you can have a saddle when you learn to ride. And then he brings over this length of rope and ties a muzzle around the nose of the horse and hands me the trailing end and says, here's your reins and your halter, right? A single rope. So I'm sitting there on this horse with my legs sticking out like toothpicks. I was only 6 years old, holding the rope. And then Dad gives me a switch from the cottonwood tree that's standing nearby. And I says, here. I said, how do I make her go? And he says, here, use this. So he hands me the switch. He says, don't hit her hard. And remember, no matter what, you're in control, no matter what. So I brought the switch down on Nellie's rump, and she shot out of there like a rocket, and I'm like,
Mhm.
in 2 seconds, I'm in total terror, flying across the pasture, and I gripping mane in my hands. I couldn't figure out if I was even on top of the horse still. After about 5 or 6 seconds, and she jumps the faucet, And I came down on the ground, shimmying down her foreleg like a fire pole, and landed on the ground with a rope still in my hand. And I survived it, but Dad should have never put me in that position. That was it was just not good judgment on his side.
Yeah.
10 years later, I knew that I had to sort of tiptoe around Dad a little bit, and one day he was going to give me a ride somewhere. I was 15. We get in his car. It's not an old car. It's only 4 or 5 years. It's a Chrysler. The car wouldn't start. So he's angry and he's upset, and he races into the garage and comes out with a can of gas, opens the hood, thrusts the can of gas at me, and he says, "Here, pour this gas into the carburetor when I try to turn it over." And I'm thinking, even at 15, I almost did a roll of the eyes. I says, "Can this be right?" And so he turns over the engine, and I'm pouring the gas out of this, it was one of those spouts out of the red gas cans, you see, and immediately a gush of flame, erupts out of the carburetor and almost reaches the spout, and I fling it away, and it was like, and I could smell the combusted gas, and my heart went through through the roof. And, which is enough. I said, but my dad was not to be challenged, right? I'd seen my older brother get knocked down when he challenged my dad. So I should have really confronted him at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a 15-year-old, and he weighs 40% more than me. So it's like, no, I'm just going to have to swallow this one. But that was a kind of a mistake also. So, it was, the way he dealt with me, was something that I knew I had to change. So I guess that's just sort of the way it was. Yeah. I have to loop back to your question there. Maybe I've lost track of it a little bit.
No, that's good. No, I think it's, I don't know. I think it's pretty common where, we all have these memories that maybe our dads don't even remember them. I don't know. Like, they stuck with us, it's just, and they were kind of a key memory for us for whatever reason, and they stick with you. And then, subconsciously you kind of base decisions off of that, right? You realize, Dad's not to be challenged. I can't trust him. And so subconsciously that affects you, as you're growing up, as you're getting older, as you're starting your own family. Did you ever get a chance before your dad passed away? Did you ever get a chance to talk, not maybe necessarily about these instances, but about some of those things that, you went through while you were being raised?
Yeah, right. I remember now the context was your question about what was the chapter like, having the conversation with my dad on the porch. Right? Yeah. Sorry. Yep. So I lost that a little bit in getting into that story. No, the direct answer to your question is I did not ever get back to those specific items like, "Dad, what the hell were you, trying to do there? Did you see?" Yeah. But we did grow closer as he softened in his older years, and we got to a point where, I could tell him I loved him. And he said the same to me, but already he was in his 60s. Okay. And so 20 and 60s, it was in the 80s already. I'd had kids already, we're sort of halfway through. But he died, when Catherine was born. So he knew the oldest daughter, and we could bond a little bit about him being a grandfather and that sort of thing. But I didn't challenge him directly, and I think it was a big mistake. Yeah. I think you have to, I read somebody who sort of boiled this down into a simple statement. You have to kill your dad. Okay. In a sense, you really have to confront him on those sharp edges. And I'm no psychologist. Okay. I'm not recommending this to people, but it's kind of a lesson that I learned, and I'm looking back, and whether I could have done it ever, I didn't, so yeah, it's hard. Yeah. But the rest of the conversation on the porch was, about, we talked about the individual kids a little bit, and, what I think he might have thought about them, but he was proud of me for being a good dad with them, but he could see also the mistakes that I made. So that's sort of what that closing chapter is about.
Okay. Yeah, and I know you mentioned too, like, throughout your career as your kids were growing up and stuff, that you traveled a lot. You traveled a lot, moving to other cities. Now, one of the things, I so obviously, this is the Fatherhood Fitness Podcast. So we talk about fitness, nutrition, health, and all that stuff. But we also talk about leading your family well, right? We want to make sure that we're putting ourselves in the best position to be the best leader for our families. And when you're traveling that much for work, like how did you kind of manage like the tension between like being a president dad and also like being successful in your career?
Excellent question. Excellent question. I mean, I worked in Washington for the World Bank. It's an international organization that helps poor countries. Okay. There's a AAA rating on the capital markets and that sort of thing. But what they do is they lend money to governments for things that the private sector is not interested in or can't make money on, like water systems, in poor countries.
Mhm.
So I would travel. The first year I worked there, it was 100 days a year, and so I was gone a third of the time. And I managed to taper that down over the years, but it did create a lot of problems. On the other hand, it was a stressful job because I ended up in the slums and squatter settlements in cities, talking with
Mhm.
people about getting water and sewage and stuff like that. And I saw kids the age of my kids, living in the mud. And it gave me like extra motivation and appreciation for the kind of life my kids had, and made me a little more excited is too strong a word, but ready, to embrace my kids when I got back. Not that I was going to tell them about what I was doing. I said, "Yeah, Daddy's traveling, Daddy's working, he's trying to, make a living for the family and stuff like that." Um, but it brought home the need to be close to them when I could, to really
Yeah.
appreciate their circumstances and to to cherish, their becoming as human beings, because I
Yeah.
saw the alternative could be pretty bad, in other places. At the same time, Linda took a heavy, heavy load. My wife Linda, during those times, we,
Mhm.
we could afford help, so we had help living in, but it's never the same when Dad's absent. And my dad traveled when I was a kid too, a lot, and it was one of the things I think was created problems for us is he was gone 5 days a week, he'd come home on the weekend tired and ornery and
Yeah.
and difficult. And so it, so I didn't think about this until this very moment, but I could see why I was extra careful to hug the kids when I got home, to drive them out and get ice cream, to take them to
Yeah.
school, to do everything I could to sort of be with them. Yeah. So yeah, the work scene, yeah, that's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I don't travel a lot for my own career, but we homeschool our kids. My wife is with them quite a bit and stuff, and so like I do multiple different things, to provide. And there are times too where like I just feel like I always have to be uh kind of on when I'm with them, like in a good mood and stuff. And it's like,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's necessarily true. I had a conversation with somebody one time, and I had mentioned something about like I always remember my dad, like he would be at work, he would be gone, I would come home, and he would always like kind of be in a good mood and stuff, and or he would always like be willing to play catch or something outside. And the person I was talking to mentioned, they said, oh, like, oh, he like, and so like, so maybe you realized like you weren't allowed to show like when you didn't have it all together. And I was like, I've never thought about that before. I said that's pretty interesting, because I think maybe you felt that way too, from your dad. It was like you maybe kind of got the opposite, where he wasn't in a good mood, you always had to be in a good mood. And well, how does that affect, like, are we like, and I'm not saying this happened to you, but like are we teaching our kids like they have to be and so it's like
That you
you
have
never know.
that you have to be on, you mean?
Yeah,
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 yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's another good one. Looking back, I can't remember that. Uh, at least there's no ready memory of feeling like I had to be there and I had to put on the show. Okay,
yeah.
but Of course, I'm sure it happened. I'm sure it did. But my recollection, if I sum up these, 30 years or something like that, my kids are in their 40s now. Okay. So there was like,
Yeah.
uh, that, what I thought of, I used to think I would have to bring home a little gift for the kids when I traveled, a little sort of
Hmm.
compensation. Dad was gone. I was gone for 10 days, 2 weeks at a
Yeah.
time. And, but later, as they got a little bit older, I said, no, I'm not bringing home gifts anymore. I'm going to take them. We're going to go do something special. And so instead, I, would pile in the car and say, okay, let's go down to the store. You guys can pick out a gift. Let's talk about what you want. What do you need? And,
Hmm.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we'd get ice cream and, sort of build in little special moments. Um,
Yeah.
so it was, it was a way of trying to reset, and to come to some balance with the kids. And, um, but the kids were also engaging. So Eric played baseball, Catherine played soccer, Alana was all kinds of sports. And so sports was a kind of an important part of our lives. And we made
Yeah.
up games as well,
Yeah.
like, I remember breaking more than a few pieces of furniture in the living room, throwing a Nerf ball around. The two youngest ones, okay, you get 3 points if you can catch this one over your head, and
Yeah.
4 points if you catch it diving onto the bed, stuff like that. So we would try to invent time to show our best selves. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think
That's
that was
good.
important. I think it really worked. I also uh, was lucky enough in our circumstances to find some special trips. Like, for
Mhm.
instance, Eric, the youngest one, who had the toughest row to hoe in my family, I think, because he was he's a bright kid, and he's very aware of the circumstances and what's going on, but he also has this audio processing and hearing problem, and so it was. And Catherine, his next oldest sister, would always ask him, "What's the plan? Where are we going? What time do we leave? What do we do? What are we doing tomorrow?"
Yeah.
And at one point, when Eric's like 4 years old, he says, "Stop using my brain." And so I tried to, for Eric in particular, find a way where just he and I could get together and go away
Mhm.
somewhere. We went to the beach, and we turned out that the guy living across the street was a connection with NASA, so I got some VIP passes to go down and watch a rocket launch, which was
Awesome.
spectacularly
Yeah.
fun thing to do. And, it was down by Disneyland, but we weren't interested in Disneyland. We wanted to see the rockets go off, so
Yeah.
yeah, it was a lot less expensive as well. So
Yeah.
that was another way, of sort of inventing some things that were special for the kids. Uh, yeah. So
Yeah. That's really cool. And now you mentioned, kind of playing sport. That was kind of a big part of your kid's life and stuff. And it's just staying active. Like you're 82. You seem like you have lots of energy. You seem like you have a lot of life ahead of you right now.
I hope so.
Yeah. What are some things? What are some things that maybe you do currently or have done up to this point too? I mean, obviously, writing a book is a challenge. I'm guessing writing a book, later on in life makes it even more, just to stay with that energy. So what kind of things do you do to just kind of maintain that?
Yeah, well, this is a good question too, Anthony, because my parents met on a tennis court. Okay.
Okay.
And so they put my brother and me also on tennis courts when we were 5 and 7, public
Awesome. Yeah.
courts, stand in line with 50 other kids, work your way up to the front, hit one ball, go back to the end of the line, kind of deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so uh, I took my kids, all of them started around the same age, around 5, put a tennis, and racket in their hands, and we'd go out in public courts and hit the ball. And to this day, they don't do it out on their own, but when we get together, we go out and play.
Yeah.
So, and I continue playing a couple of days a week now. I was thinking about, just before we came on the podcast, also about athletics and physical fitness and
Hmm.
nutrition and stuff, in our lives. And for a while, when we lived in Washington D.C. for 25 years, and
Hmm.
when we were there and the kids were growing up, I had this routine of going up into the top room of the house where I had some weights and some, and I kept very careful track of, how many, core strengthening exercises I did, or, how many lifts of this or that.
Yeah.
Uh, and kept it on a spreadsheet so that I could progress and remember, and so I had this long
Yeah.
spreadsheet. And for me, it was also a way I think of cleansing the system a little bit, of getting
Hmm.
my mind off of um, there was a drumbeat of doctor's visits and pharmacies and drugs and
Yep.
therapies and hearing aids that got broken or got lost or things that needed to be fixed and stuff like that. And
Hmm.
so the let's call it daddy training program was very helpful in that way. And I still try to, a couple of days a week playing tennis, and if I can do 3 or 4 pull-ups, once
Yeah.
or twice a week, then I'm happy.
Okay.
Because it releases those,
Yeah.
um, uh, hormones in your body and makes you feel alive. And
Yeah.
I'm lucky. I mean, I'm fit. I realize I'm declining. I'm not as strong as I used to be. Muscle mass is
Yeah.
losing. I'm losing weight
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But you got to deal with that.
Yeah.
So
No.
be aware,
Yeah.
Anthony. It's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're a testament to just staying consistent with it. Being able to play tennis now, like that's awesome. Like, just, I mean, I think like weightlifting is great. I think weightlifting is important. Doing cardio is important, but being able to just move your bodies in different like weightlifting is very up and down. A little
Right.
bit of side to side, but
Right.
tennis, you don't know where the ball is going, so you gotta you
Exactly.
gotta you gotta stay agile, and
Yeah.
it's like you gotta run around, and just.
You got to
But
go fast,
not.
and then you got to go
Yeah,
really quickly.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, stuff like that.
not,
And
yeah,
and it's a tennis is the kind of thing. I mean, any sports that like this, I think, is there's always something to learn. There's something more
yeah,
to learn or to get better at.
yeah,
And I think last week I played and I felt, wow, I got my serve in every time. I'm hitting great serves. I can hit some spots, and maybe that's the best tennis I've ever played. So, hey,
yeah,
yay! Let's celebrate
yeah.
that.
That's all.
Yeah,
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah, and so obviously, that's something you can do. You can do with your kids. You can do with your wife. You
yeah.
can you can do with just some friends playing around and stuff. We haven't talked too much about your wife yet, but I know you've been married 50 years, which is
50 years this July.
pretty rare,
Yeah.
and so that's awesome. And so, but before, yeah, I was gonna ask you, like what are some of the biggest lessons, but first I would like to say, like, what would you say has like been the most like impactful experience? Like spending 50 years with somebody is, that's a lot of time, right? Like even though like we know our parents for 50 years, we don't live with them for 50 years.
Yeah,
It's like
right.
we don't live with our kids for 50 years, and so the only person that you really have the potential of getting to know that well your is your wife. And so, like, what would she say? Like, her, obviously, reading the book as you're going through this process, like, well, what would she say? Like, has this impacted you? Like, has this process of writing the book changed you? Like, what's her perspective on everything?
Well, an early perspective was, I said, this is my book. It's a daddy book. It's not about you, Lynn. Okay.
Yeah.
You're not in the book. And then I gave her here's the manuscript. And she says, are you kidding me? You can't say this, What do you mean I'm not in the book? And, and she was right, she was right. And, it wasn't a smooth sail by any stretch, not just
Yeah.
writing the book, but also living the life. And we had a lot of fights. We went head to head in over a lot of issues because we're two very different people. She's a
Yeah.
New York City girl. I was born in Yuba City, California, population,
Yeah.
whatever, 4,000. Okay. And um, it's interesting because her father was a softie. My father was a hardy. Okay.
Yeah.
He was a tower of bricks. And her mother was a hard driver and my mother was a softie. So we had these two different perspectives on
Yeah.
ourselves and in our lives and towards our kids. So we
Mm-hmm.
butted heads a lot on how to manage the kids. She would say often, you got to step up and be a dad. You have to step up and be a dad. She was playing the man card, be a man card.
Yeah.
And I had to not let that knock me off center, because I knew
Yeah.
it was a kind of and at one point we had this argument, and I said over the kids when they were like, this is 30 years ago. She said, I said, somebody's got to be a mother for these kids, because she was being very harsh with them, very hard, requiring too much in homework kinds of stuff. And then she looked at me and she says, well, somebody's got to be a dad, So we had these issues, but the same thing, she's a trained psychologist and she's very good at what and she sees a lot and gains perspective and worked with families of divorce. So she knew all of the issues. I was completely outgunned in these kinds of arguments, right?
Yeah.
She knows all the issues. But I respected her opinion, and I respected how much she did to particularly get Catherine through the crisis, and I think to this day, it was mother's breast milk, that she was pumping to get to the hospital. I could put it in Catherine's, lips in a bottle that did more than anything else to save her life.
Yeah.
I really believe that. And ever since then, she's very strong. Linda's very strong, and she's a tiny little thing, but boy, she doesn't give ground and she states her opinion. And I'm a kind of more softer guy, and okay, let's think about that. And maybe you're right, and stuff. But it's like, as I read somewhere, it says you never have to win all the arguments.
No.
Just take the long view. The kids really need parents over the long view, particularly my kids. And so, we're best pals now. We cuddle up at night and watch it. We're watching a lot of Korean soap operas now.
Okay.
It's very strange, right? It's like the political situation in America is disconcerting. Okay, to say the least.
Yeah.
So we get into we sort of turn off the news and get into a completely different orbit. So, we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary just last July, and all the kids were there.
Awesome.
And it was.
Yeah. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so 50 years, like you talked about this earlier about how like dads now, like you like my dad, your dad obviously less than mine, but like dads now don't have social media and things like that. And you obviously, your kids are already grown and stuff, but they started seeing, video games like you mentioned, social media and stuff now. What would you say, like, obviously from the way you were raised with your dad to the way you raised your kids to now, like everything, like it's completely different, right? What would you say is kind of the biggest challenge dads are facing right now with raising their kids?
Yeah, because I think that there's so much more stimulation for the kids in social media, Instagram, TikTok. It can be pernicious, and people are seeing that now. This person Haidt, who's has a bestseller, been whatever 50 weeks on the bestseller list about the impact of social media on kids. And I think that I mentioned a little bit earlier about always looking back and trying to correct something from the past and sort of missing what's happening in the future. The key thing for me was, and thinking about that, was being close to the kids. Even if they're playing games, okay, there are discipline issues and, sort of organizational issues in the household and setting some rules and stuff like that. But that can work, and you have to do, probably had to do more than I did. But the key thing for me was being close to the kids, getting in their world, understanding what's going on, sitting down, level, eye to eye with them. They're not looking up at a towering authoritarian figure, but rather looking across at somebody they can trust was probably the most important factor of all, I think, and still is needed now, maybe more than ever, in the social media time.
Yep.
There's half a dozen stories in the book about, I'm driving Eric to kindergarten, and the closer we get to his kindergarten, the more tears are coming out. He's silent in the back seat, but I can see in the rearview mirrors he's crying. And by the time we get into the driveway, he's sobbing. And so I get into the back seat with him, and sit there next to him, or him on my lap at sometimes, and what is it, Eric? What's the problem? And then I realized it's hard, isn't it? School is hard for you. And boom, out came the tears. And or Catherine, when she was 13, she walks into the kitchen and slams her high school books down on the table, and and she said, it was amazing. She said, "I'm going to make something of myself." She said, it was like, whoa. And then I sat down with her, and we're again, sort of eye to eye level, and she looks up at me, with her red eyes, and she says, "Dad, if I hadn't been sick, could I go to Yale?" Sorry, that hit me like a ton of bricks, because she was aware enough from her sister's conversations with her friends about college that there was something up there to reach for. Okay. And so then I had to level with her. Yeah, Catherine, if you hadn't been sick, you could have done anything, right? But the point was, to be close to her and to understand her concerns and to empathize with her. And I think those kinds. There's two small examples, but there's a bunch of them. I think that looking back, I think they were really important.
Yeah, and I think just having that personal connection is incredibly important. Especially as they are getting older, they're developing, and I think social media, tablets, phone, everything we have just threatens that, right? It just makes it. Why go outside and kick a ball around when you have the entire world on your phone?
Right.
I think no matter whether it's 100 years ago or 50 years ago or today, like having that personal connection with your kids is incredibly important. And now we need to make sure that like we are putting the things in place where these other things don't take precedent over that. Like it's easy to be if your kids are upset, and it's easy to turn on the TV, watch a movie rather than connecting and talking through it and stuff.
Right, exactly. And or to put them on we're always busy with work. We've got to attend to whatever 55-minute task in your working day. Okay, it's just like just doesn't add up, and you're always pulled in different directions. I know I was at the World Bank. My God, it was crazy, and there's just no end to it. And I think every generation has some sort of challenge like that, but just remembering that they're becoming. There's gold in there, and they're becoming something, and you're helping to guide it. Yeah.
That's awesome. I think I like that. They're becoming something, and it's our job to help
exactly
kind of foster them, help bring that out of them. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, this has been a really great conversation. I think I'm excited for the book to come out here in the next month. I believe you said beginning of October. And like I mentioned earlier, I'll definitely put the link there and everything. And just hearing you talk, I can hear the passion that you want. You have something to share, which I think is really cool, right? This is personal for you. This is something that means a lot for you. So I think that's really cool. As we wrap up here, is there anything that we didn't touch on, or anything that you kind of want to leave the audience with?
It was a great conversation, Anthony. You posed some really good questions, and I see your experience at this and what you do. I think we covered a good gamut of issues, and I hope that I was able to bring value to your podcast. And no, I think I'm very happy, and thank you very much for having me. Yeah, the book is Holding Up the Sky. Go to holdingupthesky.net, and you'll see you can pre-order. So
Okay.
thanks for the
Awesome.
opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being on. And like I said, those links, that link will be in the show notes there. And thanks again, Tim, for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That concludes this episode of the Fatherhood Fitness Podcast. Thank you for those of you who took time out of your busy schedules to listen. If you have any questions or comments or an idea for a topic for a future episode, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to hear from you.